Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor. This is the very first Turning Hard Times into Good Times show, and it is no accident that we have Edward Griffin. He's the author of a book that I think all Americans should read. It's called The Creature from Jekyll Island. Ed's with me today. Ed, welcome.
Thank you, Jay. Good to be here.
I believe The Creature from Jekyll Island does, in fact, address the very most important issue that we're trying to address in this radio show, and that is, what is the cause of our current economic malaise? Why did we get ourselves into so much trouble? And Ed, that, quite frankly, is the reason that I'm delighted to have you on as our first guest in this show. For those who are not familiar with Ed's work, I want to just start out right away by suggesting that they go to his website, which is realityzone.com. Is that right, Ed?
That's right.
We have so much ground to cover, Ed, and we have so little time to do it here, and less than a half an hour. I think that we can give maybe our listeners an introduction to what The Creature from Jekyll Island is all about, but I'm not sure that we're going to be able to get into the kind of depth I would like to get into, but maybe sometime in the future we can do that, I hope, or at least if I can just get people to read this book. You know, I tell people at all the speaking engagements that I'm involved with, I always tell people they should really read this book because it really outlines, as I said, the heart of the problem, I think, that we have in our financial markets right now. Ed, let me just start out by mentioning that the first chapter of your book is entitled The Journey to Jackal Island. The book starts out by talking about this clandestine gathering of a group of men who boarded a luxury train, I believe in Hoboken, New Jersey, to go to this place called Jackal Island off the coast of Georgia, and they were pretending to go duck hunting, if I'm not mistaken. Could you tell our listeners who these men were and why were they pretending to go duck hunting, and what was the real purpose of their meeting?
Yeah, you're quite right. It's hard to cover so much ground in so little time. The book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, ostensibly is about the Federal Reserve System, but it's much bigger than that. It's about the nature of money. It's about economic laws. It's about the abuse of the power to create a nation's money and how that abuse leads to corruption in government and so many things that are now descending around our heads. But it ostensibly is about the Federal Reserve System, which is the mechanism by which the United States creates money on behalf of the government. And the meeting to which you were referring back in 1910 at Jackal Island was the seminal meeting where a small group of the wealthiest people in the world, or representing their firms, 7 of them, went to Jackal Island because it was out of the beaten path. It was very private. And, in fact, they even denied for quite some time that they went to such a meeting. It was a secret meeting. And it was at that meeting that they hammered together all the important details of what was to become the Federal Reserve System 3 years later when it was passed into law in 1913. Now, the reason they did this in secret and denied that they were participating is a very simple reason. The Federal Reserve was offered to the American people as an agency of the federal government. Supposedly they thought it was an agency of the federal government, and it wasn't. But it was offered to them as an agency which was supposed to put the reins on the very powerful banking dynasties in Wall Street. The people of America were very concerned by this huge power, economic power that had coalesced into the hands of a few Wall Street investment firms. They knew that the credit of the entire nation was wrapped up in a few banks and insurance companies. They were concerned about that, and they thought that the Federal Reserve System was going to put controls on those very wealthy, powerful institutions, and make sure that they served the purposes of the nation rather than the private purposes of the corporations. And so the reason for the secrecy is that the very corporations and institutions which supposedly were to be controlled by this legislation were the ones that were drafting the legislation. They decided that, well, okay, the people want some laws now to control our industry, so we're not going to wait for enemies of our industry to write those laws. We will do it ourselves, and we'll hide that fact. We'll let the people think that it was done by their noble politicians when, in fact, we are the ones that are drafting it, and that's the reason for the secrecy. It's a very simple and an obvious logical arrangement when you think about it. And the people that went there, the 7 of them, were Nelson Aldrich, who was the Republican whip in the Senate, one of the wealthiest men in the country, Abraham Piatt Andrew, who was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury at that time, but he came from a banking family, and that's the reason he was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, because basically he had banking connections. Frank Vanderlip was there. He was president of the National City Bank of New York. Henry P. Davison was a senior partner of the J.P. Morgan Company. Charles D. Norton was president of J.P. Morgan's First National Bank of New York. Benjamin Strong was there. He was head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company. And finally, Paul Warburg was there, who was a full partner in Kuhn Loeb and Company, which was a representative of the Rothschild banking dynasty in England and France. And, of course, his brother, Max Warburg, was the head of the Warburg Banking Consortium in Germany and the Netherlands. Those are the guys that drafted the Federal Reserve Act. And when you look at the wealth which they held individually and which their banks and institutions held, according to estimates at the time, which we pulled out of the New York Times, was that they represented about 1/4 of the wealth of the entire world. Now, that was, in other words, the very banking cartel, the industry, the money trust, as they called it in the newspapers those days. Mm-hmm. That was the very money trust that supposedly the Federal Reserve System was supposed to control. Mm. And they drafted the legislation. Well, now we jump ahead to today. What's the fruit of that? The reason these guys created the Federal Reserve System is so that they could use the governmental power that backed it to make sure that they would enjoy a nice, handsome profit no matter whether their businesses failed or succeeded. They knew that if their businesses were probably going to fail because they were undergoing very unsound banking practices. They were lending money they didn't have. They didn't really concern themselves too much with the ability of the person to pay, or the institution or country to pay back the loans, because they knew that in the event of a crisis they could always go to the taxpayer and get the taxpayers to put up the money to cover the losses. That was all started back in 1910. And, you know, for years people tried to tell the American people that this is what's going on and you better look out because, you know, you're going to wind up picking up this huge bill. And nobody was interested. They said, I don't believe that. Anyway, we're living well, aren't we? Look at the prosperity. Mm-hmm. Well, now, here we are now in 2009. And it's finally coming down the way some of us have been predicting all these years. And now people are saying, well, what happened? Well, how did this happen? How did we let this happen? Yeah. Well, they let it happen is because they didn't care.
Yeah.
They didn't take an interest. Now it's very, very, very late.
But Ed, the reasons given to us, you know, constantly by the media has always been, you know, it's for our own good. They're going to manage the economy. They're going to be able to avoid significant downturns in the economy by having more liquidity, by having the Federal Reserve being able to create lots of money. But you know, that obviously isn't working out too well, is it?
Well, no, that's always been the argument from the very beginning, back in 1913 when they passed the bill. It was all to help America. It was all to help you folks, the average person. We are doing this, the bankers are saying. We bankers are doing this, and we politicians are doing this for you folks. Not all. We don't benefit, do we? Of course not. It's a bunch of nonsense. It's propaganda, and it's just amazing to me that the average voter is so politically illiterate that they fall for that stuff over and over and over again. They actually believe that the government is there to help them. You know, they actually believe that.
Well, Ed, you could say in a way then that the stated reasons for the Federal Reserve's creation has been a failure, perhaps, but has the Fed, looking at it from through their own eyes, if you could do so, has the Fed's real reasons for being created been a failure, do you think?
Oh, it's been a rip-roaring success.
Uh-huh.
The Federal Reserve has succeeded on every one of the principles which they set out to do back on Jackal Island when they discussed the purpose of the Fed. Mm-hmm. First of all, it was to control the competition. They were concerned over the arrival of new banks springing up in the South and on the West Coast of the expanding nation in those days, and they wanted to keep control in New York with the existing biggest banks. They wanted to be able to pass on their losses to the taxpayer. They wanted to be able to create money out of nothing so as to manipulate interest rates, which would drive people to the banks to borrow money at low interest rates rather than for people to save money and do whatever they wanted to do, expand business or take vacations or whatever they wanted to do with money. Instead of saving the money, they wanted to bring the people into the banks to borrow monies because the banks make money only when others come in and borrow. The banks really don't want you to pay back your loans. They want you to just keep those loans open forever, like a credit card statement, and just send in your interest every month.
Well, Ed, as I understand, as the United States was a young country in the early 1900s, it was growing very rapidly. The late 1800s, it was growing very rapidly, and there were a lot of very successful companies that were not really needing banks. They were actually growing from internally generated funds. That is, they took their profits and reinvested them so that the institutions, the industrial companies themselves were actually, in a sense, banking interest, and they were crowding out the big New York, the money center banks. Was that then part of their reason, was to avoid that competition? Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying, yes. They did not want private capital formation. That was almost like a dirty phrase. They spoke, how can we circumvent private capital formation, as though it was an evil thing. They wanted people coming to the banks to borrow money rather than save it.
Well, we've heard this phrase recently in the mainstream media, privatizing profits, socializing losses, and I guess that's what they've been doing. But Ed, when we're talking about now, we're talking about not billions of dollars, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars and even trillions of dollars of socialized losses that the common folks are being asked to shoulder. Is that what's going on here? And did that all have its origins back in 1910 then?
That's right. It's been going on for a long time, but it's certainly accelerating right now to the point where I think the cup is going to be full. I mean, there comes a point when you do have total socialized government, socialized industry, socialized everything, banking, healthcare, and so forth. You start off with 10% and then 15, 20, 30, 80, and so forth. At some point, you get to 100%. And I think we're very close to that, and these guys in Washington are laying out the roadmap to get us to that point in a very short period of time now. And when we get to 100%, I think people need to realize that not only is the economy totally regimented by government, but people themselves are totally regimented by government.
And Ed, I think that it's true that socialism doesn't really create wealth. It is a consumer of wealth. The capitalism really creates wealth. We're going to have to take a break here in a little bit, but one of the things I want to ask you about is gold, and what role did gold play? Gold has been the enemy of sort of the fractional reserve banking system that the Federal Reserve has espoused. So, when we come back, maybe you could address that issue a little bit, or maybe get started on it right now for the next few seconds.
Well, yeah, just to get started on it, gold has always been the enemy of politicians and bankers who want the ability to expand, create money supply out of nothing so they can collect interest on huge amounts of nothing, literally. Gold has always been a discipline which they hate. And so there's a great propaganda war to convince the American people that gold is not a good thing. You should not have a monetary system backed by gold. And I'm not quite sure why, but they've heard it so many times that they just repeat it.
So I guess it would not be a gigantic surprise to you then that when the Gold Antitrust Action Committee, headed by Bill Murphy and a couple of those folks, the hard money camp, really started to talk about this issue. Was that a surprise to you when you heard them talk about conspiracy on the part of the government and banks to control the price of gold, or at least to keep it from rising so rapidly?
No, it wasn't a surprise to me. I was just mad that it took them so long to get there. Because that thing has been going on. The manipulation of the gold supply and the price of gold has been going on for a long, long time. But I'm sure glad that that committee came into being because they had the expertise and the knowledge of being able to figure it out and explain it.
Okay, we're going to have to take a break here. We'll be right back with Ed Griffin in just a few minutes. We're back again. This is Jay Taylor, your host for turning hard times into good times. I'm with Ed Griffin. And Ed, before the break, we were talking a little bit about gold. We just introduced the topic. Gold is a subject that's near and dear to my heart. It's been very kind to me. We've invested in gold and gold mining shares over the last number of years, and it's done very well. While the equity markets have fallen out of bed, gold mining and gold itself have been very, very good for our portfolios. But I would like to get back to just asking you why it is that gold is such a problem for the Federal Reserve and for those for the establishment, frankly, right now.
Yes, well, there's a group of economists out there that worship at the feet of John Maynard Keynes, who was a well-known collectivist writer and economic theorist some decades ago. And Keynes called gold the barbaric metal. And Karl Marx picked up on that theme, too. He thought that gold was a barbaric metal. And all of the collectivists agree with that because they see that the ability to expand the money supply at will, the ability to just create whatever amounts of money may be required for whatever your scheme is, gives tremendous power to those who hold the ability to create the money. That's pretty obvious. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure that out. But when a money supply is based on something which limits its growth, and certainly gold would be in that category, then these guys don't have the power to just manufacture money out of nothing. Like right now, Congress and the Federal Reserve would not be able to create these hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars. They just would not be able to do it.
Well, let me understand, Ed. They don't have the ability with a gold standard to redistribute wealth from the people that create it, the miners, the manufacturers, the inventors, the farmers, those people that actually create wealth to themselves. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yes, that's right. When money is backed by gold or silver or anything else of tangible value, then its supply, the supply of money, always keeps pace with the growth of the goods and services within society. Mm-hmm. There's a good reason for that. We probably don't have time to go into all the mechanics of it, but it has always been that way, and so that the value of the 1 ounce of gold or silver always has remained constant throughout those periods mm-hmm. of history where money was backed by gold or silver. Just to give you a brief example, if we had lived in ancient Rome in times of Caesar, and we had a 1 ounce gold coin, we would have been able to spend it and buy a very nice toga, a handcrafted belt, and a pair of sandals. That would have cost approximately 1 ounce of gold. Today, thousands of years later, if we have 1 ounce of gold, we can exchange it for Federal Reserve notes, run down to the clothing store before the value depreciates, and we can buy a nice suit, a handcrafted belt, and a pair of shoes. So the value, the true purchasing value of 1 ounce of gold really hasn't changed in thousands of years mm-hmm. because the amount of energy to produce that suit, that belt, and that pair of shoes is approximately the same amount of energy required to dig out 1 ounce of gold from the ground and purify it and put it into a coin.
I can tell you, Ed, it's a very difficult task. I've been down in mines a mile under the earth, and the amount of engineering and capital and so forth and expertise that's required to get gold from the ground is a heck of a lot harder, I think, than it is for these central bankers to create money out of thin air.
Well, of course, yeah. And so the politicians and the bankers who want that power to be able to create money out of nothing, to accomplish their political objectives or to collect interest on the money, which they go through the motions of loaning out, that's a tremendously heady power that they have. They hate the idea of having a monetary system limited by the quantity of gold or silver which people can dig out of the earth. So that's the war, and unfortunately the average American is not aware of that. Mm-hmm. He just thinks that, isn't it nice that the nice people, these elected representatives in Washington are giving all this money away, and then they're going to help us, mm-hmm. and they don't realize that they're giving money away that they're taking from the people in the first place, and they don't understand how they're taking it. Well, they're taking it, first of all, through taxes, but that's the smaller part of the picture now with these huge amounts that they're creating There's no way they're going to tax the American people enough to pay for all of that. So, but they're going to get it anyway, and they're going to get it through higher prices, through inflation. It won't be too much further down the line, and the average guy will be saying, how come I'm paying $35 for a loaf of bread?
Right.
And they're going to wonder what hit them.
Ed, you know, it has to be that way, you think, because there's trillions of dollars that the Obama administration is now promising to pump into the economy to bail people out or for one sort of works program or another. And the Chinese don't have that kind of money. Where is the global savings going to come from to finance that? I guess that's the issue, isn't it?
Yes, there would be no global savings. They're going to get this from the sweat of the average worker. That's where it's all coming from, and always has come from, when these collectivists get hold of the political machinery and start spending more than they have. Then it starts to ricochet down, and eventually it hits to the average guy, the worker, who's out there working for a living, and he pays it either through taxes, direct taxes, or indirect taxes called inflation. That's the only place it ever comes from.
Ed, I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes. We got about 4 minutes left. I'd like to spend a couple of minutes to talk about housing. I know that you talked in your book about housing debacles in the past, about how the government has intervened in the housing market, and now we've had the biggest housing bubble that we've ever had, and it's pulling down the whole economy, obviously, as you know, millions of homes cannot be financed. People don't have the wherewithal to finance them. Would you care to just comment a little bit on the current housing situation, and does this thing have a lot further to go before we see the bottom of it?
Well, that second question is one that I wouldn't touch with a 20-foot pole, because I don't know how much further it has to go.
Uh-huh.
But I can say in general that the housing market was greatly inflated, or bubbled, as they say. And what that means is that the number of dollars that were being spent for a piece of real estate were way out of proportion of its underlying value when measured against other things.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that came about is because of manipulation of the credit markets, the ability of the Federal Reserve and some of the other agencies which were politically supported to redistribute credit unnaturally into certain favored areas. And the home market was one of the favored areas. They made mortgage rates ridiculously low. And that lured people, is like luring a fish to grab a worm, not realizing that there was a hook underneath the worm. It lured people to snap at those great interest rates, and they said, I can afford that monthly payment, and they upgraded into their housing, and first thing you know, they're living in semi-palaces, and they think, this is wonderful, not realizing that they had already been hooked for the contraction, which was destined to come, because everything eventually seeks its own level. And so what we're seeing now is a return to realistic values. And all the bubble is being squeezed out of it, or all the water is being squeezed out of the sponge, or whatever analogy you want to use. What the point will be when it finally is at the realistic level, I don't know. But I suspect it has a little more to go before it really is realistically compared to other things that people can buy with that same dollar.
There's going to be quite a bit of pain, then, you suspect, for the economy for most people in general.
Well, I think so. I believe so, and I almost hope so, not because I want the pain, but because if we don't have the pain, there will be no change. If we don't have the pain, the present policies will continue, and I know what lies at the end of that road. The end of that road will be a completely totalitarian system, where you and I will not only have any money to buy things with, but we'll also have no freedom to do anything with anything we bought in the first place. That's where it's headed, and that worries me even more than the economic crisis.
That's the worst thing, as Ron Paul has said. If we have our freedom, we can recover, but if we lose our freedom, it's very, very difficult to recover economically.
Exactly.
Ed, have you got some ideas about what people should be doing, either for themselves or to try to help steer the country back in the right direction?
Well, the reason I formed Freedom Force International is because I wanted to deal with that very question. I don't think anything is going to change, Jay, until we change the thinking of the people who go to Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. Right now, most of those guys are on the gravy train, and they're thinking about collectivism, they're thinking about power, they're thinking about, feathering their own nests. We need some real Americans in there that think about the nation first, who understand the basics of economics and money, and who have an ideology that is not the same as communism or socialism or Nazism. Yeah. I mean, what we have been following in our own government of late is so close to those ideologies that we have dreaded and fought against in the past, and we're adopting the very principles here at home. We need people in Washington that are going to take a return to the principles of liberty and freedom and individual worth that we used to have in this country. If we can do that, then we can dig out of any kind of a mess that comes along. But if we continue down the path that we're going, then I don't think we're going to dig out. And that's the reason we created Freedom Force International, is for people who want to help in that reversal process to come on board and work together with us.
Excellent, Ed. We're running out of time here, so I would like to tell people that they should go to realityzone.com. Is that where they can learn more about?
Well, realityzone.com is the commercial site where you can buy all of these books and videos and things. But the place for Freedom Force is called freedomforceinternational.org.
Excellent, Ed. I'm so glad you could be with us for our very first show.
Well, what you just heard was my March 2009 interview with Ed Griffin. He's the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, which I think is one of the most important books that you will ever read, because it really lays out who is in control of the Anglo-American Empire and who really runs your country. Unfortunately, nothing has changed in a positive direction since I spoke with Mr. Griffin. If anything, the intervention in the markets have made things even worse than ever, with more debt to GDP burdening the Western world and, most of all, the common folks. To try to keep the fraudulent game going, however, it is essential for the criminals that run our country to continue to rig the gold markets and the silver markets, and actually almost all markets, just as violently an anti-free market approach as the rulers of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany did in the past. In fact, if we were honest and called a spade, we would admit that the United States now, its economy, is more like a fascist economy each and every day. One of the mechanisms that is used to keep the wool pulled over the eyes of average Americans, as well as the boys and girls on Wall Street, is to cap the gold price, especially when gold should go up higher. That's when massive paper selling, the futures markets, which are really controlled by a handful of bullion banks, are hit very, very hard. High margin accounts, very little money from people who have endless amounts of money created out of nothing to hammer the markets down, to keep the mindset of Americans continually focused on the paper markets and on the products that Wall Street can create out of thin air.